Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first Agriculture and Food Forum for this year, with a focus on how we feed a carbon neutral world. My name is Anna Koltanoff, and I'd like to begin with apologies for a delay in the start of the proceedings and move on to the acknowledgement of country. We gather for this meeting from different places around Australia, and I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we meet. I myself am joining you today from Ngambri country in South Australia. I pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us online today. As we share and discuss our knowledge and practices, we acknowledge the deep knowledge forever embedded in the custodianship of country. So I'd like to now hand over to my co-moderator, Snow Barlow, who will now move on to housekeeping and introduce the speakers.
Good morning. I'm Snow Barlow and I chair the Agriculture and Food Forum within the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. And today I come to you from Tuggeranong country in the Strathbogie Ranges of Victoria. As Anna said, this Ag and Food Forum webinar series has the overarching title of Feeding a Carbon Neutral World. Today's webinar, we're looking at the implications of escalating input costs for Australian farmers. Is it COVID or is it an emerging trend? What we began last year in 2021 with a great webinar from Tim Reeves examining what the impacts of COVID had been on agriculture in Australia and internationally. And the conclusion was that agriculture had been very adapted and had managed to actually operate very well under the COVID world. And indeed, as we've probably seen this morning, Australian agricultural gross product in 2021 actually reached $81 billion, a record, I think. However, as there are in many other places in the world, there are a few clouds appearing within the cost structures of Australian farmers, namely escalating input costs. So today we've asked two of Australia's most eminent agriculturalists. Firstly, Professor Ross Kingwell, who is the Chief Economist in the Australian Grains Innovation Centre at the University of Western Australia, and a former president of the Australian Society for Agricultural Economics. And we've asked Dr. John Kirkegaard, Chief Research Science and Head of the Farming Systems Research at CSIRO, to give us their impressions, firstly from Ross as an economist, what's behind these escalating costs, and are they a COVID blip, or are they a sign of continuing trends in that area? And then John Kirkegaard will talk on what are the implications for farmers of these costs, and what are their alternatives within Australian farming systems. So firstly, let me ask Ross Kingwell to give his presentation, which will be followed immediately by John Kirkegaard. And just a small question of housekeeping before we proceed with Ross. You can ask questions, and we will encourage you to do so at any time, but please ask them through the Q&A function on your screen rather than the chat function. And if you vote for questions there, they will automatically sort of rise to the top. And these will be the questions that Anna and I go to first after the presentation. So let's now go to Ross Kingwell in his presentation.
Okay, what I want to talk today about is really trying to give you an understanding of what lies behind the cost inflation that farmers are currently experiencing. So there are three key messages in this talk. Firstly, I just want to reveal what is the magnitude of input price increases that farm businesses across Australia are currently experiencing. Then I want to very briefly show what are the business, that is the farm level business ramifications of these heightened prices of key farm inputs. And I want to spend more time giving you an explanation as to why are we seeing these price increases. So what's sitting behind these price increases? And these price increases, I'll just concentrate on fertilisers, chemicals, that's mostly herbicides, and fuel. They're three very important types of inputs that go into agricultural systems. And let's start by looking at diammonium phosphate. This chart shows the way in which the price of DAP fertiliser has altered since 2017. And you'll see that for much of the period in recent history, that is since 2017, the prices of DAP have fluctuated, but they've fluctuated in that band shown by this red oval shape. However, what's happened throughout 2021 is a consistent escalation in the price of DAP fertiliser. And so it now means that when farmers are undertaking farm budgeting and engaging in crop production, they're now facing input prices for DAP fertiliser that are 2 or 2.5 times the price that they would have paid in previous years. And it's even worse when it comes to urea, the source of nitrogen. Again, if you look at the experience of farmers over the last several years, when they have annually developed their farm budgets and applied fertilisers, it's been against the background of a fairly narrow band in the fluctuation of urea prices. But that has not been the case in 2021. And so when many farmers look to undertake their farm budgeting and input and field planning decisions for winter crop production in Australia, they're now looking at heightened prices of urea. So again, there's been over a 3-fold increase in the price of urea. Turning to fuel, again, we are in very rare territory because the current prices of Brent fuel are prices that we have only ever seen once before in the last 30 years, and that was a period at the end of the 1990s. And those of you who have to fill up your cars will know only too well the current high prices that are being demanded for fuel. And this is a problem that is observed across the globe. Fuel prices are at a peak, and fuel, as you well know, affects not only farm operations, but it affects the transport of inputs onto farm. It affects the price of moving farm products off farm down to consumers, be they domestic or export customers. When it comes to key herbicides, again, we are observing price spikes. Many farmers in South Australia and parts of Victoria and New South Wales have had to engage in a lot of summer weed spraying, and they have learned firsthand how expensive those farm operations have been, because they tend to rely on glyphosate as the key herbicide for weed control in summer. So what's the farm level impact of all these input prices escalating? I'm going to show you a typical wheat production budget. This is an actual farm in Western Australia, and the farmer has shared these figures with me just to illustrate what it means for them in their planning for wheat production this season. So in this particular case, it's a fairly high yielding environment. So the wheat yield is typically around 3 tonnes per hectare. The wheat price conservatively is a free in store price of $325 a tonne. When you multiply the price by the yield, you get $975 of wheat sale income per hectare. Of course, the farmer then needs to pay for the cartage of that grain, the storage, research levies, endpoint royalties that go to the wheat breeders. You take off those deductions and you end up with a gross income of $885 per hectare. And then there are a range of inputs that need to be applied in order to generate that yield: seed, fertilisers, herbicides. In the case of West Australian wheat growing conditions with their acidic soils, it's increasingly common practice for farmers to apply lime, and then there's repairs and maintenance and fuel. So the combination of those operating costs are about $354 a hectare, leaving the farmer with a net profit of $531. And of course, out of that, the farmer has to pay all the fixed costs, the overhead costs, the tax, any personal expenditure. So that's really a gross profit figure. That's the normal situation for this farmer that they would prepare a budget for. Now let's look at the situation in 2022 with the impact of heightened input prices. Let's assume that the yield and the price are unchanged, so the gross income is the same, the cost of seed is the same, but suddenly and quite unexpectedly, with respect to historical precedent, is a heightened cost of fertilisers, an enlarged expenditure on herbicides, even though there's no change in the rates of application of those herbicides. There's more money required to be spent on fuel. What that, of course, means is that when you have the same application rates of inputs and yet those inputs are more costly, then net profit declines. And in this case, the farmer, without doing anything different, that is, it's just a turn the handle exercise, nonetheless, they are facing a 61% reduction in profit. It's a bit like for most of us online, being salaried or superannuated people, it's like saying, well, just do the same as you ordinarily do, but do you mind receiving only 60 or 40% of what you normally would receive as a salary, doing nothing different? And that's the situation for a farmer going into 2022, looking at doing nothing out of the ordinary and yet experiencing an over 60% reduction in their profit. And what it means is that what's known as the net profit ratio, that is the net profit you generate per dollar spent on operating costs. Normally, for every dollar that you spend on operating costs, you can expect $1.50 back in net profit. You know, that's the difference between the if you like, or the ratio of the 531 figure of net profit to operating costs of 354. But in the new environment, it means that for every dollar you spend on operating costs, you're only getting back 30 cents now in your net profit. So you're spending all this money and the margin on each dollar spent is being drastically squeezed. And not only are farmers experiencing high prices for inputs, just getting hold of inputs is a challenge. This is a slide that just looks at USA farmer survey responses in February this year, where the farmers were recording that they were experiencing difficulty just getting hold of particular herbicides or fertilisers, let alone finding the revenue to pay for them. So availability is a real issue. So I want to spend a bit more time now just exploring why are we seeing these price increases. And I think the paradigm to use here are the 3 Ps. That is, it's a combination of production, impacts, perturbations, and government policies that are leading to higher prices. Let's look at production. The reason for the increase in fuel prices is essentially because OPEC countries have, following the onset of COVID, when there was a reduced demand for fuel internationally, OPEC countries have sizably decided to reduce their production of oil and to maintain that reduction. At the same time, coming out of COVID, there's been an increasing demand for fuel, and yet OPEC countries have not enlarged their production of oil. So the supply of oil has stayed low coming out of OPEC countries. That has forced countries to run down their fuel stocks. And this is a chart that shows the global petroleum inventories and how they were built up during the early COVID period, and then since the decision by OPEC countries to greatly diminish their supply of oil onto international markets, countries have been forced to run down their stocks. So the only sources of available fuel now are dwindling stocks and whatever supply is available. And so it's no surprise that price becomes the rationing of that limited supply. And the prices we are seeing are not just due to a slow increase in demand for fuel coming out of COVID, but it's principally due to curtailment of supply. Let's look at fertilisers. And this is an interesting chart because it shows the countries that are principal exporters of fertilisers, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, and the principal countries that need to import those fertilisers. And there are a few countries that are the dominant exporters of fertilisers. That's Russia and China are the principal sources of exports of fertilisers. Canada is a principal exporter of potash, along with Belarus. Morocco is an important supplier of phosphate. But Russia and mainland China are very important sources of nitrogenous fertilisers. Having said that, it's no surprise that when it comes to the exports of all fertilisers, that Russia and China are very important international players in the supply of fertilisers. China is the world's top exporter of phosphate, including DAP. And remember, the first chart I showed you was a chart in which the price of DAP rapidly escalated in 2021. Now, why was that? Well, essentially it was because in 2021, China undertook a policy decision to ensure that its own agricultural sector had access to affordable supplies of fertilisers, and so it suspended fertiliser exports. Chinese farmers, like farmers across the globe, during 2021 were experiencing quite high prices for fertilisers. To make fertilisers more available to boost agricultural production in China, the Chinese government took the decision to ban exports. Similarly, late last year, Russia, for similar reasons, limited its exports of nitrogen fertilisers for 6 months. And the reason being it was trying to curb domestic food inflation in China. The Russian government is very sensitive to food inflation. It has placed export taxes on its wheat. It's tried to make agricultural inputs of fertilisers available to its local farmers so that those farmers can profitably engage in farm production. The ramification of that policy decision is that there's been a massive reduction in the availability of fertilisers to importing countries like Australia. And again, this is a supply side story where if you reduce supply, price becomes the rationing mechanism. Then there are important perturbations that you may or may not be aware of. I'll give you one example. Hurricane Ida was the second most damaging and intense hurricane to be experienced in the USA. And what you may not realise is that there was significant damage to the USA's largest plant that supplies glyphosate. Now remember, the US agricultural system is dominated by glyphosate-tolerant crops of corn and soybeans. The Luling plant was shut down for 5 weeks due to cyclonic damage. That means over a month's worth of supply of glyphosate disappeared out of the US agricultural system. And then just a couple of weeks ago, Bayer Crop Science announced what's known as a force majeure event in one of its key plants that supplies raw ingredients in the manufacture of glyphosate. And Bayer Crop Science have indicated that the failure at that plant is going to take around 3 months to restore. So again, there's been these perturbations of disruptions to the supply of a key agricultural input, namely glyphosate. Then, as Snow mentioned at the start of this proceedings, that COVID has had big impacts in China. Factories have been closed down. That includes factories that manufacture pesticides and herbicides. This is so large has been the impact of these closures and shutdowns that the GDP growth in China has diminished. Also, there's been port closures in some of China's main export ports, and that's led to port congestion, and that's led to difficulties getting agricultural inputs out of China to destination countries like Australia. So we're now seeing almost record prices for glyphosate. We're seeing record prices for container access. So the accessing a container is now almost 2.5 times more expensive. Getting containers back to China is not an issue. That's the purple line. What's known as blank sailings have been occurring, where ships have bypassed ports like Fremantle, Adelaide, to make up time to pick up empty containers at the Port of Melbourne and then take those back to China. The big expense is getting containers out of China. And that expense adds to all the cost of inputs. Every agricultural chemical used in Australia that is imported via containers. It's not a bulk transport. It's a containerised export. And wherever you have congestion, delays, port disruptions, then we have difficulties not only at the Chinese end, but we have difficulties at the Australian end, where the MUA has seen fit to use the current conditions as a platform on which to undertake industrial action to extract their own advantage. And that, again, has caused delays and problems getting material off boats into the hands of farmers. That's going to be a short-lived thing in that if you look at ship construction, there is going to be a massive increase in 23, 24 in the number of container ships that become available. So that's going to reduce congestion issues in 23, 24, and particularly as COVID dissipates in China. Then you've got the perturbation of what's happening in Ukraine. The statistics there, I think, speak for themselves with respect for the likely outcome there. But there are many ramifications of what's going to unfold in Ukraine. You've already got the USA sanctioning exports of potash from Belarus, which is the supporter of Russia and its involvement in Ukraine. You've got Lithuania already blocking the transit of certain Belarus fertilisers. You've got Belarus companies claiming force majeure problems, meaning that they can no longer honour contracts for the supply of potash to many customers. There's Russia is a very important source of fertilisers. So is China. You've got Germany sanctioning Russia, which means that natural gas will not be flowing from Russia into Germany, and that's going to raise the price of natural gas outside of Russia, and it's going to add to the cost of urea in the EU by driving up the price. And I'm sure there are other things to unfold. Turkey is now banning the exodus of Russian ships through the Black Sea. That's going to make it very difficult for Russia to export its grains. So the summary is that there are expensive inputs for farmers in 2022, and I suspect that's going to continue into 2023. There are huge impacts on farm profits, and there's a variety of reasons for these high prices. So a corollary of what I've been saying is the question, well, what can or should farmers do? And in this case, I'm going to hand over to John to just talk you through the particular case of nitrogenous fertilisers and the important role that accessing nitrogen fertilisers plays.
Thanks very much, Ross. And thank you to the Academy for this invitation. I'm coming to you from Canberra, from Ngunnawal country. A shout out to all my friends up in Queensland and northern New South Wales. I hope you're doing okay. So as Ross said, I'm going to pick up where he left off, but focus in on one of the important inputs that Ross mentioned, which is nitrogen fertiliser. And I'm doing that because it not only has implications for farmers' bottom lines, but also for the fertility of their soil and the country's aspirations for carbon sequestration. So that's one reason I thought it was an interesting case. I've got 4 points. I had to outdo Ross. He had 3. I've got 4. I first want to talk about the fact that in Australia, inadequate nitrogen supply currently limits productivity and profitability in wheat farming systems. It also is the mining of nitrogen from soil organic matter is also causing a loss of organic matter and therefore carbon from soil, and also limiting our capacity to rebuild that. But that higher nitrogen supply can increase both yield, soil fertility, and can reduce our greenhouse gas intensity, which may come as a surprise to many people. And therefore, this discussion about higher end prices and their implications, it's an urgent technology challenge, and both for the growers, but also more generally for decarbonising the farm, the broader agricultural system. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on each of those and talk you through it. But first, let's have a look at wheat productivity, and let's actually celebrate some success and of the ingenuity and resilience and of farmers and technologists in Australia in how we've been able to sort of turn around what was a definite mining of fertility in the early years with breakthroughs in better varieties and the realisation that about soil nutrition. Then the introduction of legume-based pastures rebuilt fertility again, and we got a nice jump, but then a flattening. But I guess over the course of my career, what we've seen is this very large increase in the intensity of cropping on the back of no-till systems that rely on herbicides for weed control, but less cultivation, stubble retention to protect soils, but also the introduction of break crops like canola into the system to deal with diseases, and the consequent response of these crops, these higher yield potential crops, to nitrogen fertiliser. You can see, of course, we don't escape the impacts of the weather. Millennium drought put a lid on productivity for quite a while, but more recently we've jumped up. But bear in mind, 2 of the best years on record we've just experienced. And so the question is, where's productivity heading, particularly in the face of climate change? What impact will these input prices have? What role does nitrogen have to play? And what, if anything, can we do about it? So one question is, well, how close are we to the potential, to the productivity potential in Australia? And there's been a lot of talk about this and a lot of work on this, what you call the yield gap, the gap between, on the left, what growers are actually achieving commercially, and on the right, what we think the crops are physiologically capable of, grown with best practice and with the water limit and other environmental limits. So that we call the yield gap. probably as an agronomist, and Ross certainly as an economist, would be more interested in what we call the exploitable yield gap. What's the actual yield gap a real grower can operate within, given the the economic limits and the risk associated with pouring on too many inputs? And so that's the gap we're more focused on today. And fortunately, my colleagues V. Hoffman and many of his colleagues have been working very hard on this in recent years, and we actually have mapped the yield gap in wheat and other crops. If you ever want to go and have a look at a great website, it's there. And so effectively, Zvi has modelled right around the Australian wheat belt in every local shire the potential yield, compared it with what growers are delivering, and therefore you can derive a gap both in yield in absolute tonnes per hectare, but in relative terms. And you see that in most areas we're only achieving 40 to 60% of that potential yield. So given we're only aiming for 80, that means we've still got a 20 to 40% exploitable gap. So we've got room to move in lifting our productivity further. Now, Zvi and others have also done a lot of work to demonstrate that one of the biggest drivers of that gap is nitrogen supply. And whether you're doing simulation studies or analysing field data or surveying growers or more full economic analyses around risk, nitrogen continues to emerge. And this is partly because farmers are growing under very risky circumstances in Australia, both price and weather. And so they're very conscious of not overdoing inputs like nitrogen, because they want to get return on their investment. And this is just to sort of pulled a bit of the key data out of some of those studies. This is the one that used an analysis, a machine learning analysis of actual data from paddocks in Victoria, and just showing that nitrogen fertilisation was by far the biggest reason for not achieving the yield that was possible. And in the survey, looking at growers that have a small yield gap compared to growers that have a large yield gap, and looking at how much nitrogen they're supplying to their crops, whether those wheat crops are growing after a cereal or a canola or a legume or a pasture, you can see in all cases, those farmers that have closed their yield gap are applying almost double the nitrogen fertiliser. So it's a key contributor to realising our productivity potential. Now, I've been working on some farming systems projects in southern New South Wales, and I thought I would, and we've been looking at what we can do, what innovations can we explore to increase the productivity per millimetre of rainfall. And we've been manipulating things like diversity, getting more legumes into the system, taking different nitrogen strategies. We want to see whether taking a more robust or optimistic strategy with nitrogen actually pays, or in fact, do you lose money, as growers may worry, and also things like earlier sowing and crop grazing. But these experiments have been running for 4 years now, and we've done a full economic analysis like the one Ross showed you for a single paddock on the sequence of crops. So we've sort of, if you like, supercharged what Ross did for an individual crop, and we've looked at what happened across a series of years, because nitrogen and water carry from one year to the next. And if you want to pick up the impact of something like a legume in your system, you've got to follow the nitrogen for many seasons and convince farmers that just looking at single year budgets may not tell them the whole story. And indeed, what we have found is that the baseline systems of sort of just cereal canola only with a fairly conservative nitrogen strategy did respond to higher end. They were more profitable with higher end, despite the fact we had 2 sequential droughts and 1 good year. That was surprising, but it was indicative of how nitrogen is driving things. And secondly, at all those 4 sites, there were systems that involved a legume with a lower nitrogen strategy, so a lower fertiliser strategy, but including a legume that outperformed that baseline system that had higher nitrogen, and outperformed it by $50 to $200 profit per year. And not only that, there was less risk, lower cost, and weed and disease levels were going down. So we have room to move in our farming systems to improve productivity and nitrogen's a big driver, and whether we do better with our fertiliser or we integrate legumes better, we have those opportunities. Just to show you from that data what the effect of these high end prices are, what I'm showing you there is the average annual EBIT. So EBIT's just profit, the same profit Ross showed, but I've subtracted some of the overhead costs. So it's a little bit closer to a true profit. And you can see that, as Ross showed you, for most of the period we were running this trial, the prices of fertiliser are about $400 to $500 a tonne for urea. And we were making, you know, on average, Ross showed, I think, around about $500. So that's pretty consistent. And if I just plug in the current fertiliser prices, which are up the other end of the scale, to all of that data that has all of the other economic information involved, and only change the nitrogen price, you can see that I do have a declining profit. This is with just the canola wheat system, what I call the baseline system, with a conservative nitrogen strategy. If I take a more robust nitrogen strategy, and I just told you it was more profitable over the last 3 years, and if you look down that left-hand end, it was more profitable, but you can see what happens when nitrogen prices go up. Taking a much more robust nitrogen fertiliser approach is actually going to cost profit. And this is only nitrogen. Ross showed you that many other inputs farmers are using are facing similar increases in price. But interestingly, integrating a legume, of course, into the system, which doesn't require nitrogen itself and fixes nitrogen for following crops, is going to maintain higher profit levels, you know, if you can integrate those and you have a market for them and your farm's suitable to grow them. And of course, that's a lentil system. This is sort of from Wagga, so the lupin system was still quite profitable as well. And you can see as the price of nitrogen goes up, there's not such a big impact on the bottom line. So that's a little bit about productivity, but as I said, nitrogen is also very important for maintaining soil organic matter, and I think this is a little bit overlooked, and I want to just show you some data for this. So I've been running a long-term field experiment for 30 years at Harden in southern New South Wales, mostly looking at the effect of no-till, so reducing cultivation and retaining stubble. Now, surprisingly, after 30 years of that, I really didn't find a big difference in the soil organic matter between those different treatments. They all declined, and they declined faster in droughts because there was less input. That just shows you a picture there of, you know, even comparing those two treatments, there wasn't a large difference in soil organic matter. And so that was very surprising. But it's not surprising when you think more about it. And my colleague, Clive Kirkegaard, did his PhD on this. You don't find carbon in soil, you find organic matter in soil. And organic matter is carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur in predictable ratios, because most of the soil organic matter, the stable soil organic matter, is microbial detritus. So the microbes have to eat the residue, convert it into their own bodies, die, and leave you with the stable soil organic matter that decomposes slowly to release the fertility that we've all come to expect in our soil, but forgotten that you've got to put it back if you want to build soil organic matter back up. And so every tonne of soil carbon that you want to sequester as soil organic matter is going to have to find 85 kilos of N, 25 kilos of P, and some sulfur, as 12 of sulfur. You're going to have to find that somewhere to go with that carbon if you want to build soil organic matter. It's got to come from somewhere. And therefore, Clive's hypothesis was that nutrients, not just carbon, can limit carbon sequestration. Sure, you can also have not enough carbon going into the system, but you can see on the left, my trial at Harden had usually 9 tonnes of wheat straw every year going in, plenty of carbon, but it was still declining in soil organic matter. Why? Because I was being a very careful agronomist and just putting the nutrients on when the crop needed it, and forgetting that would mine the soil organic matter. So it was very profitable, but I was using my fertility. And of course, that makes economic sense up to a point, but it can't last forever. And there's a really simple experiment that Clive did. Here's some wheat straw chopped up, put in some sand in a bottle with moisture and left for 5 weeks. On the left-hand side without nutrients, on the right-hand side with supplementary nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur according to the ratios the microbes like. So on the left, what happens? Nothing. The microbes have plenty of carbon, but they have no other nutrients to build their populations and deal with that organic matter. On the right-hand side, they have everything they need to grow, decompose, turn over, create new organic matter, and you can see the difference there. Now, we tested that in the field over 6 years at my Harden long-term site, simply by letting Clive take over one of my plots where I was incorporating the residue every year. So on one side, we just continued to incorporate the residue every year. On the other side, Clive sprinkled a bit of fertiliser. It's not a lot, 5 kilos of N per tonne of wheat straw and equivalent phosphorus and sulfur. But he just sprinkled it onto the soil every year before we incorporated the straw. The same amount of carbon has gone on every year for those 6 years. And after 6 years, on the right-hand side where we were putting 9 tonnes of residue in, we lost 3.2 tonnes per hectare of carbon. Where we added some supplementary nutrients, according to those ratios, we increased the soil organic matter by 5.5 tonnes. First thing I've done at that site that actually increased soil organic matter and arrested the decline. So that's a net difference of 8.7 tonnes in 6 years. So it's a really good demonstration of that point. So we have to be very careful with our agronomic sort of thinking around nitrogen use efficiency, which is kilograms of grain produced per kilogram of nitrogen fertiliser added, because effectively the person with the best efficiency will just be the person who's mining their organic nitrogen the most effectively. So that balance of nutrition is a real missing piece in the conservation agriculture movement, which is, less tillage, more stubble retention, diverse rotations. They need to add balanced nutrition if they want to maintain soil fertility. Equally, there are voices in the debate who think fertilisers are bad, that nitrogen fertiliser is bad. But I hope I've shown you that fertilisers are not our enemy. Microbes need fertility too. They don't produce it. Some of them produce it. Rhizobium on legume roots can produce it, but most other microbes in the soil need fertility, and they've got to get it from somewhere. They don't produce it, which I think some people believe, and therefore we need adequate nutrients if we want to sequester carbon. And whether that's for payment or whether that's to maintain the productivity of our farming system, it doesn't matter. The nutrients need to be there, and I don't think as yet there's been a lot of research capitalising on this stoichiometry theory, and I think there should be more. But you're going to tell me that nitrogen fertilisers are real baddie in terms of greenhouse gases, and I mean this story is true in parts of the world, less so in Australia, where actually we're not putting enough fertiliser on. More so in parts of the world where nitrogen is subsidised. Most things are subsidised. Farmers put on a lot of nitrogen, probably more than they need, and there's issues of loss through leaching, denitrification, nitrous oxide losses. So I'm not saying it's not a problem, but in Australia, it's not as big an issue, and we need to rethink it. So when you do a greenhouse gas accounting, you look at these sort of 3 different scopes, as they're called, and I want to acknowledge Marcia Svenster for this work. And there's 2 scopes. There's the farm emissions, and there's the emissions to do with producing the fertiliser that I'll just focus on today. But Marcia and I have basically put the ruler over that long-term trial at Harden. And mostly when people do a life cycle analysis of carbon for greenhouse gas purposes, they don't account for the change in soil carbon. Okay, they just account for all of these things shown here on this graph, which are the on-farm and the production carbon-related things. And basically, you can see here, this is Clive's treatment, his incorporate treatment, where he added nutrients. Now, not surprisingly, he's been putting more fertiliser on, and he's also been doing a couple of extra operations to incorporate. So that's led to sort of higher emissions compared to where we didn't add the nutrients, and some of the other treatments at that site, the retain till and the retain no till. So that's looking pretty bad. But factor in, and the fertiliser is a big part of that. And this is over the whole 30 years of the trial. If you factor in the change in soil carbon, right, and I've just told you we've lost quite a lot of soil carbon at that site, and that loss in soil carbon is shown in the hatched bars. Now, if you take into account the fact that Clive's treatment with added nutrients has lost less soil carbon, it makes an enormous difference to the actual budget of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions that you conclude from that. And that's just due to the difference in nutrition and its impact on rebuilding soil carbon. So Marcha has done a recent study for the grains industry to look at this greenhouse gas scenario across Australia, and it's a fantastic report. If it's there if you want to have a look at it. But she's provided this slide for me, and they basically here are looking at what they consider to be a baseline, sort of typical baseline grain farming system at 100% there, and then they've looked at different things. You can see that the set of bars in the second set are to do with nitrogen, sort of best nitrogen, maximum nitrogen. So they've been playing around with different things. On the end, it's rotations, and they've looked at things like control traffic and other things. But if we just focus on the nitrogen, no doubt the adding more nitrogen, as I've shown you, will help production increase, and that's those dark blue bars, and it will increase the absolute emissions with that increase in production. But the emissions intensity will decline. So the amount of carbon produced per ton of grain is declining, and I think it's the carbon intensity that's the important point here. When you look at that in more detail about the contributions to that, and on the left-hand side here, we're looking at emissions per hectare. On the right-hand side, we're looking at emissions per tonne. So the intensity, you can see that by including that blue soil carbon change, by acknowledging the buildup of soil carbon that occurs by putting on more soil nitrogen and not mining the soil carbon that's there, you see you really do, you see a different picture. And in fact, the net effect is either stable on the left-hand side, or in fact, intensity is declining on the right-hand side. So in conclusion, I hope I've sort of demonstrated to you that higher nitrogen supply can increase yield, soil fertility, and reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of grain farming systems in Australia. But clearly, higher nitrogen and other input prices are going to exacerbate the risk-driven decisions farmers make. So, you know, in the face of this evidence for all the benefits of applying more nitrogen, they're faced with prices that are going to make them you know, be even less likely to apply the nitrogen that they require to optimize those things, because it's going to increase their risk and decrease their profit. So that's a challenge. There are numerous promising research areas to try to de-risk nitrogen strategies for growers and to decarbonize the end supply, things like green ammonia. And so I think this is a fantastic challenge for farmers, for scientists, and for policymakers alike. And if it doesn't encourage some young, energetic scientists to sort of get into agriculture, then I'm not sure what will. So thank you.
Thank you, Ross and John. They were wonderful presentations of laying out the problem and the exacerbating factors from Ross, and some solutions from John, and some challenges which I would heartily endorse. You know, as someone who's, you know, at the end of my scientific career, it's wonderful. It'll be a great time to start again, because there's no, you know, there is no lack of challenges, but interesting challenges. So from green ammonia to incorporating legumes. So the world is always changing, and it fits perfectly with our webinar, you know, overarching title, Feeding a Carbon Neutral World, because there'll all be challenges in that world. Let's go to the first, there's some questions there. I'll ask the first question, then Anna will follow that up. Firstly, it's a question from John Dixon, and probably goes to you, John. It's really about, with regards to Clyde's experiment, was it repeated on other soils, you know, perhaps the deep black soils that occur in many parts of Australia and higher temperature? I think John's thinking of the Darling Downs, effectively.
Yeah, look, Clive did a range of studies in his PhD, from laboratory-based studies through to the field. The only place we've really tested it in the field properly, I would say, is at that site I showed you. But in his laboratory experiments, he had 4 different soil types, ranging from the sand I showed you in his lab picture, which was from Bunteen in Western Australia, which was 4% clay, through to a black clay from Hamilton near Victoria. So not quite the Darling Downs, but it was 75% clay, I think. And in each case, we saw the same thing. So he had very large containers of soil. He put the equivalent of 9 tons of residue into large containers and incubated them for 3 months. And he did that 7 times in a row. And effectively, on all soils, where he just added the carbon, there was no increase, no significant increase in the stable carbon in the soil. It just respired away. But where he added the nutrients, they all increased, and he increased the humification efficiency of the wheat residue he was using, you know, by 4 to 5-fold. So I've tried a few times. I've put in many proposals to try and check this out in the field. To be fair, a few people have tried it, but as anybody who's worked on soil carbon will know, measuring soil carbon in the field and measuring a significant change requires very careful and very intensive sampling, and not to be critical, but I think some of the attempts, you know, have not had the, I guess the resources to do that as carefully and as rigorously as you need to. But the large, you know, incubator tubs of soil were pretty convincing that it's not necessarily a soil-related thing. In the field, I think clay content ultimately might affect the upper level of soil carbon you can hang on to in a soil, because the organic matter is being held onto the clay. So no doubt soil type is going to affect things. But I see no reason why this wouldn't work. This principle wouldn't work. The challenge is getting this to work in a modern no-till farming system where we want to leave residue on the surface to protect the soil, and we need to think of clever ways that we can get nutrients to that carbon in ways that are practical and economical. But I think they exist, and I think they just need to be explored.
I think my colleague Anna will ask the next question.
Okay, so we have thank you, Snow. We have a few questions from Kadambot Sadiq, which is for Ross. And I think Kadambot asked, Ross, in your economic analysis, you've assumed that the price of wheat will be the same, but it's predicted to increase in 2022. So maybe you could comment on that, please.
Sure. Kadambot, of course, is correct there, that whenever you have a significant suite of price increases for key agricultural inputs, you're going to have production impacts which are going to resonate in international markets and lead to higher prices of the commodities that are produced by farmers. And that's certainly been the case for wheat. We've already seen this year increases in the price of wheat. The interesting issue for me is what's, again, a ramification of what's unfolding in Ukraine. The combination of Russia and Ukraine, those two countries are responsible for 30% of the international trade in wheat. And factor in that over the last few days, there's been a significant depreciation of the ruble. The ruble has never been as depreciated as it is now. Wheat is traded in US dollars. What that means is that a buyer of Russian wheat is able to offer the Russian sellers a very low price. And so on the one hand, you're going to have Russian wheat that is internationally very attractive, and it's no surprise that China has allowed the import of a wide variety of Russian wheat and grains. Indonesia is a major buyer of Ukrainian wheat. So again, the hryvnia, which is Ukraine's currency, has rapidly depreciated, as has the ruble. So in 22-23, it'll be interesting to see what happens in international markets, because at the moment, Australia is a huge beneficiary because we have a record wheat crop that is available to buyers. But following the Northern Hemisphere crop this year, which is the main source of grain that is delivered into global markets, it will be interesting to see who are the buyers of Russian and Ukrainian wheat, because they will heavily influence what the international price for wheat will be.
Thank you. Thank you, Ross. There's another question here, and this one really comes to you, John. You finished your talk with saying, you know, we've probably got to look for delivery mechanisms to deliver nutrients to the stubble you're retaining on the top of the soil. Have you considered sort of ammoniated straw? Don't ask me how you're going to do that, but have you considered delivering it in that way?
Yes, well, I probably haven't considered all of the different ways. We certainly considered, you know, spraying nutrients onto straw when we're doing our summer weed control. You know, getting some nutrients onto the straw at that stage, and there may be other ways. I think the main change in paradigm, the main shift in paradigm, is to think about fertilising the system and not the crop. So that might be. And that might mean, particularly if prices are going up, moving some of your fertiliser input back to when the straw is, when you've got freshly available straw sitting on the soil. If you supply some nutrients then in some way, an ammoniated straw might be one way, but get some nutrients with the straw then, the microbes are likely to humify a much greater proportion of that and create a slow release fertiliser sort of into the system. And so hopefully that'll come on board, you know, at a time later when you might be top dressing or when your crop needs some nutrient. But if we just continue to just consider what the crop needs and limit our fertiliser to put it right on the crop when the crop's going to take it up really efficiently, which is what all the good agronomists are taught to do, there's no doubt we potentially, if the total is not enough to supply both the crop need and the microbial needs to maintain soil organic matter, we are just going to, you know, utilise our fertility, which is what we've done in previous years with our pasture crop systems, right? The pasture builds the fertility, the crop uses it. Happy days if you can keep that running along stably. But with the decline in pasture area, the lengthening of crop phases, a lack of other legumes coming into the system, and a relatively low average nitrogen fertiliser supply rate, you know, we just need to keep an eye on that balance. So it's a matter of just shifting the thinking, and I think there'll be many people smarter than me who work on fertiliser formulations and delivery systems and other things we can think of at the agronomic end to try and to kind of enact that principle. But it's a shift in thinking. And it's not an easy one to ask a farmer to put fertiliser out when there isn't a growing crop to use it, because they're taught to believe they're going to lose it. And in Australian dryland farming systems, except for some exceptions on sandy soils and very wet places, we don't lose it. Most of what doesn't end up in the crop ends up in the microbes and is there for sort of slow release. So we need to be careful where and how we do it, but that's the shift in thinking we need.
Thank you. I think we've almost covered the questions, but I have a question for both of you, really sort of tying your presentations back to our overall webinar title, sort of feeding a carbon neutral world. Where do you think the price of carbon might have to go to actually begin to increase soil carbon?
It has to go up, Snow.
Well, that's
I'll let the economist give you the exact numbers. I'll just say
the
it's got to
science
go up.
answer. And now we've got the real answer from the economist, I think.
You're not going to like the answer, but there is no one price, because the profitability of farming alters spatially across Australia. And so farming is spatially differentially profitable. And where carbon farming, if you like, is more likely to displace agriculture in order to ensure a more carbon neutral world, or even a carbon neutral agriculture, that displacement is going to occur wherever agriculture, traditional farming, is marginally profitable, and yet the alternative land use, carbon sequestration, is sufficiently profitable due to the price of carbon that will cause a switch in land use. So if you're asking me what is likely to unfold, I think what will unfold is that those parts of the regional landscape that are least profitable for traditional farming are going to be targeted first, wherever the alternate land use is deemed to be profitable due to the increase in the carbon price. And then even in other parts of the landscape where farming is highly profitable, there'll still be pockets of that landscape on a farm which are marginally profitable for agriculture. So these will be the marginal paddocks, the marginal parts of the farm landscape, and they may well be offered up to provide sequestration opportunities, because farmers are business people and they will use the land in whichever way delivers reasonable profits to those businesses. So for some, it might be an entire switch out of agriculture into sequestration. For others, it will be a minor activity, but nonetheless a boost to their profit stream, because it represents the best and better use of those marginal parts of their farm landscape.
Ross, thank you. You didn't disappoint me. I was expecting a rigorous analysis like that, which is great. Look, we've run out of time, unfortunately. So can I thank firstly our two presenters, Ross Kingwell and John Kirkegaard, for me anyway, a tour de force through this topic. It's an ongoing topic. There will be more twists internationally, I hope, but there will be more twists in the biology and the economics of it as well. I'd also like to thank my co-moderator, Anna Coltonow, and the team at ATSE for their unfailing efforts to get us online today after, one of those glitches that happened. Murphy's is always out there. And finally, I'd like to remind you all that our next webinar in this series will be on March 23rd, the usual time, and it will deal with this, not a fraught question, but a very topical question at present, of artificial meats or meat substitutes and alternative proteins for human consumption. I highly recommend it to you. So thank you all for coming online today. Thank you, our presenters and Anna, and have a great rest of the day. Cheerio.
Thank you.